One of the greatest gifts in my life is the fact that my entire existence and my childhood growing up with Dad was all captured on camera.
She watched him walk into a ballroom full of strangers, and she completely fell apart. Not from sadness, not from grief, but because the boy standing under those lights had become someone she almost didn't recognize anymore. Terri Irwin has faced some of the hardest moments any person can go through, losing a husband, raising 2 children alone, and carrying the weight of a global legacy. But when she finally saw what her son Robert had quietly become, something broke wide open inside her, and it wasn't the transformation anyone expected. The boy, nobody fully watched, grow up. Most people think they know Robert Irwin. They picture the little kid with the oversized grin trailing behind Steve Irwin on a wildlife set, wrangling something that probably had teeth. That image stuck, and for a long time, the public was perfectly fine letting it stay that way. But while the world stayed busy mourning Steve and celebrating Bindi's rise, something was quietly unfolding with Robert that almost nobody caught in real time. Robert Clarence Irwin was born on the 1st of December, 2003, in Queensland, Australia, the youngest child of Steve and Terri Irwin. He was barely 2 years old when his father was killed by a stingray at Bat Reef, near Port Douglas, in September of 2006. 2 years old. He has no real memory of the man the world called the crocodile hunter. He only knows his father through footage, through the stories Terri tells, and through the way people's expressions shift when they realize who he is. That is a specific kind of grief, the kind where you mourn someone you barely got to meet. And for years, nobody talked much about what that was actually doing to Robert underneath the surface. The cameras caught his smile. They caught his enthusiasm with animals. What they didn't catch, at least not back then, was a boy quietly carrying something enormous, growing up in the shadow of a legend he had no real personal memory of.
Robert Irwin is the son of the legendary crocodile hunter, the late Steve Irwin, and Robert is now a wildlife conservationist.
Terri has spoken about those early years in fragments across various interviews, always careful, always protective of her kids. She described a season after Steve's death where she felt completely lost, where she had to learn how to run a zoo, raise 2 children in the public eye, and somehow keep functioning for the world. But she also made it clear that from the very beginning, Robert wasn't just coming along for the ride. There was something in him, even as a toddler, that both unsettled and amazed her. He didn't just observe animals, he interacted with them the way Steve did, without fear, without hesitation, with what looked less like bravery and more like complete natural ease. By the time Robert was 4 years old, he was already making television appearances alongside his mother and sister, and audiences quickly picked up on what Terri had been watching privately for years. This wasn't a kid performing for a camera. This was something else entirely, something that ran deeper than training or mimicry. And as the years moved forward, that something only became harder to explain away. When the resemblance stopped being coincidental. Here's the thing nobody really prepares you for when you're raising the child of someone who died too young and too publicly. At some point, that child starts becoming them, not in a metaphorical way, in a way that physically stops you mid-breath. Terri has described those moments across multiple interviews, moments when Robert says something or tilts his head a certain way, or lights up talking about an animal, and it becomes almost impossible to separate the present from the past. She has said more than once that there are moments where Robert does something, the way he talks about a particular creature, the specific way his face changes when he's excited, and suddenly it feels like Steve is standing right there in the room. She says it with tears already forming, because for Terri, those moments carry 2 things at once: joy and grief, tangled together so tightly they're impossible to separate. But the resemblance went beyond personality. As Robert moved through his teenage years, Fans and longtime followers of the Irwin family began pointing out something that was becoming genuinely difficult to ignore. The physical likeness between Robert and his father was striking in a way that went beyond what you'd expect. The same build, the same boundless energy in front of a camera, the same total fearlessness with animals that most trained adults would quietly reconsider. People who had grown up watching Steve's old episodes started saying that watching Robert felt like watching a younger version of the crocodile hunter. Not in a copied or performed way, but in a way that looked entirely natural and entirely genetic. For Terri, watching all of this unfold was not a simple experience. In interviews around 2024, Robert himself began speaking about his father with a kind of emotional depth that caught people off guard. He talked about what it meant to grow up knowing that his father had been a father figure to an entire generation, not just his own family. He spoke about how lucky he felt and said it in a way that made clear he had genuinely wrestled with that feeling rather than just landing on it. There was a grief underneath the gratitude that he didn't try to hide. And for Terri, hearing her son articulate all of that publicly, with that level of perspective at his age, was another one of those moments where pride and pain arrived together, inseparable. The world was starting to see it too. What had once been easy to frame as a cute resemblance between a famous father and his young son was becoming something more layered. Robert wasn't becoming Steve. He was becoming himself. But the echoes were everywhere, and Terri felt every single one of them. What he built when no one was counting on him. There's a version of Robert Irwin's story where he becomes well known simply by existing, by being the son of the most beloved wildlife personality in history, and doing enough to keep the name alive. That version would have been accepted. The public would have been fine with it. Instead, Robert did something most people in his position don't do. He built something entirely his own, while also honoring everything that came before him. By his early teens, Robert had already begun making regular appearances on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon.
He's a little miniature horse. Well, Sebastian, you're welcome to hold that bottle if you'd like. Sure. Loves his milk.
Bringing a rotating cast of exotic animals into the studio and handling them with a composure and depth of knowledge that consistently surprised audiences. He wasn't playing a character. He wasn't capitalizing on his last name. He was just himself, genuinely excited, genuinely informed, and genuinely funny in a way that couldn't be faked. His conservation message came through not as a talking point, but as something he actually lived. That's what made audiences respond to him so differently than they might have expected. Then there was the photography. Robert turned a personal passion into a serious body of work. Wildlife images that ended up in galleries internationally. In 2020, he took first place in a major wildlife photography competition for an image of an Australian forest devastated by bushfire.
My image depicts a bushfire. This shot was taken while on a trip and sent it over to the fire.
The photograph wasn't just technically accomplished, it was emotionally precise. The kind of image that makes a viewer feel the loss of something before they've fully processed what they're looking at. Terri saw that photograph and understood immediately what Robert was doing with it. He wasn't just documenting. He was building an argument, quietly, through images, for why any of this mattered. And then, almost completely out of nowhere, came Dancing with the Stars. Robert joined season 34 of the American competition series, and what followed was one of the more unexpectedly emotional arcs the show had produced in years. Week after week, he didn't just perform, he connected. He brought a kind of storytelling to the floor that the show's judges and audience responded to in ways that surprised even the production team. He was 21 years old, dancing in front of millions for the first time, and managing to be both completely himself and completely unpredictable at the same time. What was happening, though very few people named it clearly at the time, was that Robert Irwin was finally stepping out of the frame that the world had built for him since childhood. He wasn't Steve's son on a stage. He was Robert Irwin on a stage. And the distinction, once you saw it, was impossible to unsee. Consider what that actually means in practice. Robert grew up with a name that carried more weight than most people will ever have to manage. Every camera pointed at him, from the time he was a toddler, came loaded with a comparison he hadn't asked for and couldn't escape. Every animal he held, every interview he gave, every public appearance he made, all of it was filtered through the question of whether he measured up to something he had no personal memory of. Most people, under that kind of pressure, either shrink or perform. Robert somehow did neither. He became more specific, not less. More himself, not more of a tribute act. It showed up in small ways that added up to something significant. His conservation advocacy wasn't framed around Steve. It was framed around data, around urgency, around the real-time disappearance of species and habitats that he could document with his own camera. He wasn't asking people to love animals because his father did. He was showing them what was actively being lost and asking what they planned to do about it. That shift, from nostalgia to action, was something that belonged entirely to Robert. And that specificity, that insistence on being genuinely, recognizably himself, even while honoring Steve at every turn, is what Terri had been quietly hoping for and quietly terrified wouldn't happen in equal measure. When it finally did, and when millions of people could see it just as clearly as she could, the relief alone was enough to break her open. The night Terri broke down in front of the world. On the 14th of October, 2025, Dancing with the Stars aired what it called Dedication Night, an episode where each remaining contestant performed for someone who had shaped their life most. Robert chose his mother. Before the dance even began, the pre-performance video package showed Robert struggling to get through his explanation of what Terri meant to him. He wasn't performing emotion for the camera. He was visibly fighting to keep it together.
Teary-eyed night ever on Dancing with the Stars. Robert Irwin dedicated his modern dance performance to his mother, Terri.
He talked about being 2 years old when he lost his father, and about how, as he grew older and began to understand what that period must have actually been like for Terri, running a zoo, raising 2 children publicly, holding a global legacy together while personally devastated, his appreciation for her became something he couldn't fully articulate. He said that at every milestone where he found himself quietly wishing his father was there, Terri was there instead. He said that was enough. He barely made it through the sentence. Terri, seated in the ballroom, was already in tears before the music started. The routine itself, a contemporary piece, was built around that relationship, around what it costs a mother to carry that much, and what it means to a son who watched her do it. When the last note ended, Robert walked straight off the floor and into Terri's arms. Bindi, seated nearby, ran out to join them. The 3 of them held each other in the middle of the ballroom while the audience went quiet for a moment before erupting. The judges were visibly shaken. One commented that Steve was watching and smiling. Another, who had partnered Bindi on the same show a decade earlier, couldn't finish his feedback. He was crying. The entire room had shifted into something that didn't quite feel like a competition anymore. Afterward, Terri described the moment the way she describes most things she can barely find words for, by focusing on what she observed rather than what she felt. She said it was like seeing Steve again, but it was also completely and unmistakably Robert. She has always been careful to hold those 2 truths at the same time. She posted publicly that it was a night she would always remember, and that her son was not only a beautiful dancer, but a wonderful person. The response from the public was immediate and overwhelming. The clip circulated for days, but that wasn't the only night. On the 11th of November, the anniversary of Steve's death, Robert performed a foxtrot alongside Bindi to a song Bindi herself had once used to honor their father in her own season of the show a decade earlier. Childhood footage of Robert and Steve played across the ballroom floor during the routine. Robert finished the dance in tears. The judges awarded a perfect score. In the days that followed, Robert reflected publicly on the performance, saying that carrying his father's legacy wasn't a burden, but a direction. That everything he did, he felt his father somewhere in it. Terri watched all of it, every performance, every moment, and each time the reaction was the same. A woman who had spent nearly 20 years staying strong for everyone around her, briefly and visibly unable to hold all of it together. Because what she was watching wasn't just her son dancing, it was proof of something she had spent 2 decades quietly working toward. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the surviving parent. You carry the grief privately, because you also have to carry the children. And the children can't see you fall apart. Not completely. Not in the ways you need to. Terri had navigated that for years with a composure that the public often mistook for strength, when a more accurate word might have been necessity. She didn't have the option of unraveling, so she didn't. But watching Robert stand on that stage week after week and do something genuinely extraordinary with all the weight he'd been handed, that was the first time in a long time that Terri didn't have to hold anything together. That was someone else doing the holding. And it turned out that was the thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The win, the injury, and what Terri understood after. By the time the season 34 finale arrived on the 25th of November, 2025, something had shifted in the broader conversation about Robert Irwin. He had stopped being the crocodile hunter's son, who was doing well on a reality show. He had become the story. The stakes in the finale were already high. What made them higher was what came out in the days beforehand. Robert had been dancing through a significant injury. A strain in his intercostal muscles, the tissue between the ribs, had been causing him serious pain for weeks. His partner had mentioned it in a pre-finale interview, describing how the production team had quietly adjusted portions of the choreography to compensate, and how Robert had simply decided to push through without making it a headline. When asked about it directly, Robert acknowledged the pain, but framed it the way he frames most things, not as a sacrifice, but as a choice he made because the alternative wasn't something he was willing to consider. That small detail said something. It said something about how he was raised, about what it looks like when someone has grown up watching their mother absorb more than she should have to and keep going anyway. Not for an audience, but because the work required it. On the night of the finale, Robert and his partner delivered 3 routines. The energy in the room built through each one. Their final freestyle drew a standing ovation before the scores were even announced, with one judge calling it a near-perfect performance and meaning it without hyperbole. The vote totals from that night represented one of the most engaged finales the show had seen in several seasons. Tens of millions of votes cast in a single evening. When the winner was announced, Robert Irwin was named the season 34 champion, joining his sister Bindi in the winner's circle exactly a decade after her own victory on the same show.
The winners and new champions of Dancing with the Stars, Robert and Whitney!
The symmetry was not lost on anyone in that room, certainly not on Terri. In the days that followed the win, Robert gave a television interview that became one of the most circulated moments from that entire period. He spoke about his mother with an emotional honesty that clearly caught the interviewer off guard. He described what Terri had done after Steve died, keeping the Australia Zoo running, raising 2 children under constant public scrutiny, maintaining a conservation mission while personally devastated, and said he got emotional just thinking about what it had actually cost her. He said she was extraordinary. He said the world had underestimated her from the beginning, and the fact that he knew that he had been watching and understanding over all those years, was arguably the most significant thing about who Robert Irwin had become. Not the trophy, not the photography awards, not the television appearances, the awareness, the gratitude, the recognition of what it took. Terri, watching him say all of that, understood something she perhaps hadn't let herself fully believe until that moment. She had done it. Not just kept the legacy alive, not just held the family together, She had raised someone who could see clearly, feel deeply, and carry all of it forward without collapsing under its weight. That, more than anything else that had happened in those weeks, was what the tears were really about. Steve Irwin once said, in footage Robert has since watched and described as emotional to hear, that his ultimate goal was to one day be able to step back and let the next generation take the mission forward. That the moment he could do that would be the moment he knew he had actually succeeded at what he set out to do. He never got to have that moment. He was 44 years old when he died, and Robert was 2, and the mission landed on Terri instead, landing on her in the form of a zoo to run and 2 children to raise and a world that was watching to see what came next. What came next was this. A 21-year-old standing in a ballroom holding a trophy, speaking about his mother with the kind of clear-eyed, earned gratitude that takes a lifetime to grow. A young man who had turned grief into purpose, pressure into identity, and a name that could have been a cage into something that looked, from the outside, like wings. Terri had kept the whole thing together long enough for this to happen, and now that it had, she could finally stop pretending it hadn't cost her anything. What do you think about this deeply moving story of Terri Irwin and her son? Share with us in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. If this story was moving for you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.